Hi, folks, and welcome to White Collar Week. Today we have a very special show about compassionate lawyering, and we have on four people who I know well and whom I respect: Corey Brinson, Chris Poulos, Bob Herbst, and my old friend George Hritz. We define compassionate lawyering as giving something more than just a case solution to our clients. That is, these four people discuss putting in that extra mile and helping make their clients find a better, more productive way of life at the end of their issues. It's a important show if you are a lawyer, you know a lawyer, and most importantly, if you hire a lawyer. So coming right up, compassionate lawyering on White Collar Week. I hope you'll stay with us. So let's get started. Hello, and welcome to White Collar Week, a podcast sponsored by Progressive Prison Ministries, the world's first ministry serving the white-collar justice community. I'm Jeff Grant, co-founder and your host. I served almost 14 months in a federal prison for a white-collar crime I committed when I was a lawyer, so I know that it's the isolation that kills us, and the solution is in community. So let's get started. Good evening. Welcome to White Collar Week. We have a great podcast tonight. We have four incredible attorneys who have paths that are strikingly different, but all have practiced from their heart, have incredible stories of how they came to where they are right now. Some tearjerkers in there, some beautiful work they're all doing. We're going to let them each introduce themselves. We have, in alphabetical order, we have Corey Brinson, who's in Connecticut. We have Bob Herbst, who's in New York. We have George Hritz, who's in Connecticut. And we have Chris Poulos, who's in Washington State. So what I'd like to do is give each of them about 4 or 5 minutes to introduce themselves, tell part of their stories, and then we'll start the conversation. So, Corey, let's start with you.
Sure. Good evening, everybody. So I'm Corey Brinson. I'm from Hartford, Connecticut, and hopefully I'm the youngest one on the call, and so I should have the shortest story. So I went to UConn Law School. Always wanted to be a lawyer growing up. Ended up doing well and getting a job at the largest law firm in the state of Connecticut. Did that for 3 years, then went off to Washington, D.C., and worked at a national law firm for a year. I came back to Connecticut. This was about 2009, and ran for Connecticut Secretary of State. I did not win, but as a spinoff of needing the autonomy to run for office, I ended up opening my own law firm. And so my law firm primarily did criminal state court defense. I did some federal criminal work, some personal injury, and also employment law, which I did at the big firms. Throughout that, I did that for 7 years, had about 700 clients, about 400 in criminal court, got several not guilties for clients, and life was going well until one day the IRS criminal investigations knocked at my door, and they had some questions about my relationship with a client who had about $4 million and client proceeds from a stock fraud scheme coming to my IOTA account. So because I only have a few minutes, I'll just let you know I ended up spending 16 months in a federal prison camp, lost my license, was the worst experience ever because it was my childhood dream. And a lot of, regrets and shoulda, coulda, wouldas and all that kind of stuff I went through. But I decided I wouldn't give up. And so when I came home in 2018, first thing I did was run for Hartford City Council. That's the sign you see behind me. I didn't win, but I wanted everybody to know that I was still alive and I wasn't dead and I wasn't going away. And I ended up opening my own consulting firm called the Second Chance Firm, where I do federal prison consulting based on my experience. I also am allowed to do bar applications for people in Connecticut, even though my license is suspended. And then I decided to also become a lobbyist and do criminal justice lobbying reform. That ended up leading to me getting a job at the Legal Action Center, which is a not-for-profit law firm in New York City, where I work at today doing criminal justice reform in the state of New York. So I'm essentially a lobbyist in New York dealing with criminal justice reform, for example, like clean slate legislation, which is like automatic pardons for people in Connecticut. And so that's a great opportunity. And I decided also to go back to law school, and because I missed the law so much. So I'm working on a master's and of law, an LLM in human rights and social justice from UConn Law School. And God willing, if all goes well, my lawyer's putting in a motion so my probation can be terminated this summer. If so, I will be allowed to apply for reinstatement next year and hopefully pick up as a better man, lawyer, and person because of the experience. So that's my bio in 5 minutes.
Thank you, Corey. It's wonderful, that we share a lot of the similar pieces to our story. And Corey is a member of our white collar support group that meets on Monday nights. So I see him on these I see him on the Zoom screen a lot. George, one of my oldest friends. You're next.
My name is George Hritz, and Jeff is right that I live in Connecticut, but I actually work in New York.
Sorry.
After 30 years, well, maybe almost 40, over 40 years of practice, I finally listened to my wife and got admitted in Connecticut, where I was the oldest person and admitted to the bar in my group. My first contact with the criminal justice system was when I was working for the public defender's office, wrote a bunch of briefs while I was in law school, and visited with a young man on death row in Trenton State Prison. And I was amazed how young he was and how scared he was. I did mostly civil law. Well, actually, I clerked for a federal judge and saw a lot of criminal cases there. But I began to do civil law and do pro bono work on the side. My first job in a criminal element was as a federal independent counsel prosecutor, where we prosecuted one of President Reagan's aides. And I was really amazed. We got a guilty verdict. But at the end of the trial, the judge sentenced this fellow to community service, which was fine with us as prosecutors. But, it was very scary and sad to see the family gather around him and to see him, shamed. Although I learned later that he had really been rehabilitated significantly by his experience. The next experience I had was I'll skip forward and go to the work I did with Jeff, representing an innocent spouse of a fellow who was put in jail for what was then the largest Ponzi scheme in Connecticut state history. And I don't know if Jeff's going to like me telling this story because I'm not sure he wants it publicized. But I was amazed. This woman lived in a $4.5 million house in New Canaan, beautiful house. She barely spoke English. She had two very young children, something like 4 and 7. And she managed to get the children on public assistance so that they could get Connecticut state insurance. But the fuel allowance would run out in about the 4th or 5th day of the month sometimes for this huge house. And Jeff actually took this woman and her kids Jeff and his wife took them into his house to keep them warm and from getting the flu in one December. I'll never forget that. But that's compassionate ministering. But we pulled together all sorts of things. We had to do real estate work. This woman's entire assets had been seized by the federal government. They were really vicious. The assets were seized by Bernard Madoff's former the law firm that seized all of his assets, and they treated this guy like, and his wife and his children, like they were Bernie Madoff, which he was not. But they even had tied up her and claimed the right to her. I've forgotten the title, but it's called Quintantana. It's like the gifts that you get in Spanish countries where on your 15th birthday, it's like a sweet 16 party.
Yeah.
But it's a 15 party. And they had seized, all of her assets, and we managed to get all of the assets back, and her share of them anyway, half, which is generally what parties get in a divorce. And so Jeff and I and others have arranged all sorts of legal services for these spouses of white-collar criminals who have, some went to jail, some didn't. The next one we did was a woman whose husband was a Naval Academy graduate, and it was a marginal case, I think. I don't know much about the criminal case, but he had two young children. He and his wife had two young children, and he decided to plead guilty because the sentences for white-collar criminals in Connecticut, if you were found guilty, were huge, and he didn't want his kids to grow up without a father. And so he pleaded guilty. He served a year and a half or something like that, and did a really good job of rehabilitation. And they moved to California, and all is well. We had arranged tax issues for them. We arranged the sale of not only their house over the course of many years, and the U.S. Attorney's Office was very patient with them, partly because it was always a conversation between me and the U.S. Attorney, never involving the defendant. The defendant was somebody whose name seldom appeared, in our discussions. It was all about the wife and kids, which was really what the issue was about. The husband was in jail at the time, and he was, was ready to go. So we've done a number of other cases like that, but those are two that really stand out for me.
Thank you, George. Just to be clear, Lynn and I, my wife, we minister to them, and we help on the spiritual side. And George did masterful lawyering for all of them. So thank you for that, George. These people's lives would be substantially different if you hadn't come along. So thank you.
Well, it's been. Let's just say one more thing. It has been a transition for me because I've always wanted to do criminal work, and I've sat next to some very cynical criminal lawyers. But you don't have to do it that way, and I think that's partly the theme of this. I've started representing people in felony cases in Westchester, and part of the deal is to make sure that they don't come back again, and that the things that cause them to get in the kind of trouble that cause them to be charged with felonies don't happen again, and that's really important. So it's really ministering to the whole people as a lawyer.
Yep. Thanks, George. Bob.
Yes, sir. Well, I've known George Hritz for about 50 years. First met him in 1965 when we ended up at the same college in New Jersey. And Corey, I've never met you, but I was fascinated by your story because the word resilience came to mind when I heard what you had to say.
Thank you.
And that is a quality that I found over the years in both criminal cases and civil rights cases to be a very critical component in terms of determining who can withstand what befalls them, either in the criminal process or being victimized by discrimination,
right,
in discrimination cases, or being unlawfully fired in whistleblowing cases, or being abused or falsely arrested by the police in police misconduct cases. And so my hat is off to you for how you've handled it.
Well, thank you.
I grew up on Long Island, and after college and law school, I went to Chicago to clerk for a federal judge. My fork in the road came when I decided whether or not to be a lawyer or a journalist. Having been on the college paper in college, I was thinking seriously about that. But and my mother always told me that the pen is mightier than the sword. But I had the misfortune to go to college in the late '60s when we had the war in court, and people believed that you could make social change through litigation. And so I went to law school, and I tried to, my path is essentially been trying to do that, and it hasn't turned out to be an easy path, because shortly after we graduated from law school in the early '70s, the Republicans became ascendant on the federal judiciary. And as they did in the politics of the country, and usually the judiciary follows the politics of the country, and it's been a tougher and tougher road, decade after decade after decade, and with 200 new Federalist Society judges appointed by the Trump administration, I'm glad that I am at the tail end of my career, let's say, as opposed to beginning, because it's going to be difficult. But I served after my clerkship 6 years as a federal prosecutor, and then after a short stint in private practice in White Plains, I went back into prosecution as an executive assistant district attorney in Brooklyn for a couple of years, and then in 1983, excuse me, I went into private practice, and I've been in private practice ever since. I have always done criminal defense work, but as the years went on, most of my practice became civil rights and employment discrimination and whistleblowers, representing whistleblowers. And that's what I've done primarily over the last 30, 35 years. But I must say that my years of prosecution never left the appeal of that job, because one can be a compassionate prosecutor and do justice. And since prosecutors have run the system for the last 40, 50 years, and their discretion often more important than the discretion exercised by judges in both the state and federal systems. Having compassionate prosecutors has been important. And in the last decade, I've become a part-time prosecutor again in the international criminal tribunals of Sierra Leone and Rwanda. And that's been those, especially the Sierra Leone case, where I handled a contempt obstruction of justice prosecution, and tried the case for 5 weeks in Rwanda and Sierra Leone by video link. Was a peak professional experience, because I got a chance to work in a system utterly different than the American judicial system. So that's essentially my story, and we're happy to get into a conversation after we hear from Chris.
Thanks, Bob. All right, so Chris, from our left coast, your turn.
I'm the only one wearing a T-shirt, so I guess the left coast has grown on me here. I would have been in a suit a couple of years ago, probably sitting, even though I am in my dining room of the house due to COVID-19. We're all working remotely right now in my office. Jeff, thank you for inviting me. I always wondered, I've been friends with Jeff on Facebook for years, and I said, I wonder if he'll ever invite me on his show. So it has now happened, and it's really great to hear from the other guests here. What fascinating backgrounds you all have. So for the listeners, again, my name's Chris Poulos, and my current role is Executive Director of Governor Jay Inslee's statewide reentry council here in Washington State. So what we do is we advise the governor and the state legislature on best practices and policies and laws related to what happens inside prison and jails as it relates to promoting or harming successful reentry, and then the transition process, as well as what happens after people are released, addressing collateral consequences, different kinds of barriers to housing, employment, licensure, things that I think everyone here in this group is familiar with in one way or another. I'm formerly incarcerated myself. I have a funny story related to that that's actually, I think, perfect for this show. So I found myself, after spending some time at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, New York, eventually first going behind the wall at USP Lewisburg, and then going to the camp after that at USP Lewisburg. And there was the education director there was retiring. And I said that I'd like to work in the education department. I have asthma. They put me in landscaping. And so I'm breathing in all these, gas and grass and everything else. It wasn't going well. So I pleaded with the director of education. I don't know what his title was, something like that, to let me work as a tutor at the prison camp. And he asked if I had finished college. I guess you had to have a 4-year degree at this particular institution, or maybe that's a BOP policy in order to teach or work as a tutor. And I told him I'd done some college, but I hadn't. And sure enough, the transfer did not come from landscaping into the education department. And I happened to see him walking out. He was retiring after maybe a 30 or 40-year career with the BOP. And I saw him walking out with his box from his office of all his belongings. And I said, I thought, should I even say anything to this guy who wouldn't transfer me? And the compassion, I guess, entered my heart. And I said, I just wanted to say thank you for all the work you did helping people learn and get their GEDs and stuff like that. And he turned around, he looked at me and he said, didn't you want to work in the education department? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, I was going to get you in there as an orderly, someone who could clean the floors and stuff like that. He said, but I just had one of my teachers quit. How would you like to be one of our teachers in the education department? And of course, I wasn't going to resurface the college diploma issue, right? That's their department, not mine. And so sure enough, that kind of issue just disappeared, and they reassigned me to becoming a teacher. And I was able to spend 3 years or close to 3 years at Lewisburg teaching English language learners and basically every subject for the high school GED. And that's how I sustained myself as well. We had our regular paycheck, but a lot of people incarcerated do something on the side. And so I'd do private lessons for people in exchange for home, I put that in quotes, cooking and other different benefits that we'd have, so I wasn't so reliant on my family and friends on the outside to send me money. So one of the other tutors said to me, you work in the education department, you must be one of those white-collar criminals, right? You must be a white-collar criminal like the rest of us here. And I said, actually, white powder, not white-collar. So my incarceration was a result of a decade-long addiction to various substances that actually began in my early teens. And I experienced a lot of trauma as a youth, experienced homelessness as a youth. And after I came home from federal prison, I guess I became committed to becoming a lawyer even before I went to federal prison, when I saw the way connections, race, money, different things, different factors can impact outcomes and representation in the system. And so I was sitting in jail, and when I was sitting in county jail, I became committed to someday becoming an attorney. And so I eventually did. And went to college, went to law school, got past an initially reluctant dean, found my way into the Obama White House during my third year of law school, working at the Office of National Drug Control Policy under Michael Botticelli there. And that experience actually changed my trajectory from being entirely committed to representing individual clients on a one-by-one basis to working at the policy level. And that's how I eventually found myself in now state government as an appointee. Also teaching law now, something that I never thought possible. I started as a GED teacher at Lewisburg, and now I'm an adjunct professor of law at Seattle University School of Law, Jesuit Law School, actually, Jeff. So that's what I'm up to these days. And if you hear noise in the background, that might be my German Shepherd, who's still kind of a puppy, but we'll do our best to mute if that happens. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Chris. When I hear the word Lewisburg, because I was in the Low at Allenwood, just up the road, and so that little corner of the world between, say, it's outside Williamsport, has probably a dozen prisons between state and federal, and so everyone who comes to visit there is either going to visit someone at the college or someone at a prison. So it's so all of our visitors got to meet a nice cross section of people at the local Bennigan's or whatever.
Well, thank goodness for the Bucknell Dyson's radio station.
That's right, exactly.
And we used to put in requests too.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't think George or Bob need to be shy about having attended Princeton. So I think it's as long as we're mentioning Bucknell, we got to mention Princeton, right? So the topic tonight is compassionate lawyering. And we've all kind of started talking about that in all different ways already. But I think the thing that interests people who are going through the system, or one of the biggest decisions they have to make, is who they choose as an attorney. And often they don't know who they've chosen until well into their case. And there's a lot of dissatisfaction. These people are on the edge in trauma, going through all kinds of issues. And then they find out what kind of lawyer they have. And some lawyers are mechanics. They take them through sentencing, and they do a great job or they don't. But there's other kinds of lawyering out there, people who embrace more of a holistic kind of experience and who want to help their clients do better in life. And the relationships often extend far beyond that of sentencing. So that's kind of the topic. And who'd like to kick it off? I know you all have a lot of experience in this. Who'd like to kick it off? George, you want to talk a little bit about your spiritual, how you spend your spirit life and how that connects with your lawyering?
Well, the first thing I'd like to do is contradict my old friend Bob Herbst. Couple things
I knew that was coming.
I totally agree with is what he said about prosecutors. I have a daughter who's been a lawyer now for 2 years, and I have been trying to convince her to become a prosecutor, and she will not. She wants to be a defense lawyer. And I keep telling her that I've now met a whole bunch of prosecutors who have been really great people, and they have done more for my clients than I ever could have done. And that compassionate prosecution is a real art. Mm-hmm. And I've really come across some people who are really good at it and really bad at it. The second thing, though, I'd like to really contradict him on is that he said he was at the tail end of his career. Well, the judge I clerked for was 99 when he retired, and he died when he was about 99 and a half. So I've decided, and I know you have too, Bob, that retirement is very bad for your health. So I intend to practice law for a long time. In fact, I'm practicing law now in a firm that was started by the 84-year-old son of the judge I clerked for 47 years ago. And he said, I'm getting too old to practice anymore, but maybe you're not. So why don't you meet the best law student in my class, who's now the head of my firm? And I did, and so I'm still here.
You know, George, I felt that way up until February and March of this year. You know, I tried a case, a whistleblower case 3 years ago, which I got into 6 weeks before trial because the lawyers who worked the case up for 5 years and represented this whistleblower really didn't have the requisite jury trial experience. And the lawyer that they had retained out in California to come east and try the case in the Southern District of New York. Had the California wildfire experience and lost and had to bow out, and so I tried to absorb this record in 6 weeks and tried the case for 3 weeks, and I nearly died doing that. But had I had to have tried that case in the post-COVID environment, wearing masks, or coming from Larchmont, New York, into Manhattan on public transportation of some sort, and then going up and sitting in a courtroom with people who probably don't want to be there, because of social distancing is going to be very difficult. It's going to be. I'm not sure that I'm going to last till 99. I don't know how long I'll be, but there are the problem with the lawyering is that you are a warrior for your client. And it doesn't matter if it's in the criminal realm or the civil rights realm where you're prosecuting the wrongdoers, whether they're police officers or discriminators or what have you. And I think it's difficult to marry the warrior psychology, personality, to the compassionate lawyer. And not too many lawyers are able to integrate those two personality sides. And so you're lucky to come across a lawyer who can do that. In addition to the problems of, for example, when you get a serious disease, and you say, well, what doctor am I going to go to for this? You don't know. It's very difficult to choose a physician without a tremendous amount of help from people who know the field. And the same thing is true, I think, about lawyers. So it is a difficult problem that I don't have a lot of advice on how to solve it.
So why don't you guys kind of each discuss what your philosophies of compassionate lawyering is, why you've perhaps taken on pro bono work, what you've done to better inform yourself as someone who cares about people. Corey, you want to start?
Yeah, I'll go. So, compassionate lawyering to me is the belief that the practice of law is transcends just being a business, and particularly when you represent individuals versus corporations. And I've had the opportunity to do both. Your people are really relying on you, and the decisions that you make really can affect people's lives, and just in the criminal defense practice. And George, you're right that prosecutors. I always tell my clients that as a defense lawyer, I have the least amount of power in the room. The judge and the prosecutor have all the power, and so you're right about that. You can do more. You can affect the criminal justice system a lot more from the prosecutor's chair than from the defense chair. But part of what your role is, as you play therapist and counselor. The lawyer who trained me, he taught me something my first year of practice. Said, we're not cheerleaders for our clients, and a lot of time is letting them understand that a plea resolution, could save them years and years in their life if the trial were to go the wrong way. It also means, what I've done many times is when clients have run out of money and not thrown them out of my practice and finished up with them, with the hope that, good karma and doing the right thing, and in the universe will remember that, and that the client will remember that, and maybe send me a referral one day. And so that's also part of it, because it is a unique relationship. And so when I went through the criminal justice system, and I had a really, really good lawyer, he was a former federal prosecutor. And so as I was going through the anxiety and stress and frustration of the process, I had to remind myself what it was like to be the defense lawyer, knowing that, you had the least amount of power in the process. And sometimes, we want to blame the messenger, and oftentimes it's the system, which is why the work I think that like Chris does and what I'm doing now at the Legal Action Center on a policy level is so important, about like mandatory minimums and that type of stuff. Because I can't change a mandatory minimum law from the courtroom. And if a prosecutor doesn't want to come off a charge, there's nothing I can do except go to trial. And that may be even worse for my client. And so the policy stuff is so important. So that's what I would say about it. That it's really, it's understanding that there's your client is a human being. They have a life, they're a person, they're a family, and then getting them to understand the system and the expectations within the system. And I'll wrap up with this. One of the most troubling cases I remember was I represent a guy who had mental health issues. He had stole a car and crashed it from two old ladies at a cemetery who were visiting dead loved ones, and then crashed the car into another family having a funeral, mental health issues again. And so he was literally 18, 19, was just starting out his life, wanted to be a police officer. And so when the family came to see me, they figured, well, because obviously he had been diagnosed with mental health issues, the criminal case should go away. And I said, no, that's not how it works. You either go insanity, and then they can keep you for 20 years, or you plead guilty to this felony, and maybe they only keep you for 1 year, but you have a felony. And they, were very upset that there wasn't a third choice. And so I got fired, but they ended up literally seeing two other lawyers and then wanted to come back. So because they realized that sometimes given the tough medicine is what we do as lawyers in terms of the counseling is important to your clients who have to make the tough choices.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant. Chris, as long as Corey brought up policy, what's going on over there in Washington? It seems like you have a lot of representation from formerly incarcerated people who are now practicing law. You, Tara Simmons, Sean Hopwood spends a lot of time up there, apparently, certainly on Tara's case and on a lot of policy issues. So how rewarding is that, and how much do you get to actually touch people who are in the system?
Sure, great question. So something I've noticed in criminal justice reform, especially in the kind of larger organizations based in DC and New York, is that I don't know if it's surprising or not, but oftentimes there's very little representation in these organizations by people with actual lived experience. They say that they want diversity, and in some, there's various ways that diversity is represented, of course, but I've found that oftentimes the criminal justice reform organizations don't employ and certainly don't employ in leadership positions anybody who's actually been impacted by the criminal legal system. So in Washington, I think we're doing a bit of a better job at that than some of and this is not to call out any specific organization nationally, at least not today. That may happen in the future. But in Washington, we've done a great job of kind of lifting each other up. It was from Tara Simmons on Facebook, who's formerly incarcerated, now a lawyer. I actually got admitted before Tara did to the bar, in Maine. And ironically, in federal court, I got sworn into the federal bar in the same courthouse where I was sentenced to federal prison, which was a pretty surreal and powerful experience for me. So we really believe in centering the most impacted voices in this work, and in the words of Glenn Martin, the people closest to the problem are closest to the solution. And so, it's something I've been able to do is everyone, there's only been a couple, two actually, people who have worked as staff for the statewide reentry council, but both of whom are women, and both of whom are formerly incarcerated, and both of whom are women of color. And I think that it's important to not just talk about equity and talk about diversity, but actually to put our money where our mouths are. What I've found in some of the organizations is I feel like if you're advocating for, endangered orcas or something, of course you can't hire orcas, right, to come and do this work directly. And I feel that that's kind of like brings us back to that savior model of very privileged people who feel like when they're doing criminal justice reform, they're trying to save the group of people who have no voice or cannot somehow, speak for themselves. And I think in Washington here, we've done a pretty good job of dismantling that and, bringing people into leadership experiences that, A, meet all of the professional criteria. I think it's equally a disservice to throw someone into a role that they're not qualified or prepared for just because they've done time, something like that. But when we have multiple candidates who meet the criteria or come close to meeting the criteria, we're here gonna center and probably hire the person with the lived experience. And actually, if you don't mind, I'd love to touch on your first question too, just about the holistic lawyering. An experience I had was when I was sitting in county jail facing 5 federal felony charges. I initially had a court-appointed attorney, and I'm from Portland, Maine originally, so I'm a Northeast guy too. And I had a court-appointed attorney. We don't have public defenders in Maine. We just have people who pick up cases, lawyers. They pick up cases, generally incredibly under-resourced, incredibly underpaid, and many of whom, work their butts off, but just don't have anything compared to what particularly the AUSAs have at their disposal. So, I went and talked to this public defender, court-appointed attorney once, and in the federal system, they do have public defenders, even in Maine. But the resource difference was just so vast that when I went to the federal defender's office, they didn't even have a staff member to answer the door or the phone. I had to pound until finally one of the lawyers heard me and came out all razzled from how many cases he had and said, "Sure, I'll talk to you. Come on in. Sorry, we don't have anyone even staffing the office." And I assure you the AUSAs had a staff, to say the least. I looked at the numbers. It was 2 attorneys versus 20 employees for the AUSA's office, not to mention the law enforcement arms at their disposal. But I had a court-appointed attorney, not one of the public defenders initially. And here I am sitting in jail, and he told me, there's really no point in having a pretrial detention hearing in your case because you're accused of a federal drug trafficking charge, and there's little to no chance you're getting out. You might as well get the clock ticking on your sentence now so that this jail time will count. And I'm thinking, we don't even have discovery yet. We don't know what the scope of the evidence against me is. And this guy's already talking about, what my prison sentence is going to look like. I feel like we've skipped some steps here. I'm not a lawyer yet, but this doesn't feel right. And I got off the phone with him, and I knew that he was not in a situation where he was under-resourced and overburdened. Whatever fight he may have someday had in him was gone that day. And I felt like I was on a conveyor belt toward incarceration with different players. There's the prosecutor, there's the judge, there's my attorney. They're all just different players on this conveyor belt towards incarceration, and they have their different roles in this game towards a plea bargain. And I was able to hang up the phone and hire private counsel. I was able to get together funds from family and advocacy from friends to convince my family to help that happen. And I don't even know what they had for dinner in jail that night, because as soon as I hired an attorney for a lot of money, within hours I was released. And what happened was the attorney did some holistic lawyering. He called up the AUSA. He said, look, my client is already in recovery from addiction. He's got a job in the community. He has strong family ties. He has no resources to run. He's not going to flee. Why not let him out into the community to work on his addiction recovery to keep saving money? And then if he has to go to prison, he will. He'll self-report, or you can bring him in at sentencing. And the AUSA said, yes, sounds good. And I went home. And that was the difference. It went from no reason to have a detention hearing because it's bound to fail, to not needing a hearing because the AUSA was in agreement. And that's the power of an experience, not just an experienced attorney, but an attorney who can present all the factors in the case, and that goes right from pre-trial to post-sentencing relief and everything in between.
Let me give you the flip side of that in terms of compassionate lawyering that I had in a recent case that started about probably 6-7 years ago, when the client got a letter from a federal prosecutor in Washington, not Washington State, Washington, D.C., informing him that he was a person of interest and would he like to come in and talk. And when it was a large fraud scheme in which everybody involved, there were probably 20-30 people involved in the operation of this, so let's just call it a boiler room of sorts, would make statements that are, sort of crossing the line between outright falsity and puffing, which is often the case in a certain class of boiler room, either consumer fraud or securities fraud cases. And he was outraged by getting this letter. He said, I was there 10 years. I didn't do anything wrong. We told people exactly what the situation was, and so forth and so on. It took me about 2 months of solid consultations after learning all the facts to persuade him that, number one, he had done something that the prosecutor, the court, and a jury would likely believe was wrong, and two, that the far better course for him would be to come in and be one of the first cooperators in the case. And long story short, 4 or 5 years after that, when he testified at the trial in which 5 or 6 of the defendants were still contesting the charges, they were all convicted, went to jail for actually a reasonable period of time, not that long a period of time, and he and a few of the others who cooperated didn't have to endure a custodial sentence. So sometimes the most compassionate thing that one can do is confront the client and make sure that the client who doesn't really understand at the beginning what the real path is going to be and what the realities are, to make him understand what he has to do in order to come out well.
One of the things we do.
Go ahead. Sorry.
One of the things we do in the ministry is we help people through their trauma and their denial, because as we all know, the trauma is huge, and people are making decisions that affect themselves and their families, and it's not just that they're underinformed or ill-informed. They can't process the information, and yet they have to make life-altering decisions in the moment. So I can understand why the story that you told or that Corey told earlier, where people are in disbelief, and that's something that a lawyer has to work through.
I want to tell a story about a cooperator. I was involved in one case in front of one of the toughest federal judges in New York, and I represented 9 anesthesiologists who had been charged with Medicare fraud. And the head of not a single one of them was born in the United States. The head of their practice, who was born in the United States, who was the only equity partner in this alleged partnership of people who were actually salaried employees of his, went in and ratted on his own system, and the prosecutors gave him immunity, and then went after my clients. Fortunately, the guy decided to leave the system before I guess we ran the clock out on him, but he moved to disqualify me. I brought in a former head of the U.S. Attorney's Office in a different district to represent half of my group that he claimed I was disqualified from representing. But, the system of cooperating can really wreak havoc on the defendants, because sometimes the cooperators are the real evildoers. That was certainly the case in this situation.
What's all of you guys? Not only are you lawyers, but you all kind of have side hustles. You're doing work in the community, spirituality, religion, volunteerism. So, what are you doing out there in addition to your main profession, and how does that inform your work, and how do you think it helps you help your clients to become better citizens?
Well, I'll start with a short story. I was the first person in my family to go to college. None of my 3 little brothers graduated from college, and 2 of them died of alcohol-related problems. Mm-hmm. One in a car accident, which he and the other driver had been drinking, and another of AIDS. And that really taught me a lot about what victims of alcoholism and drug addiction go through. I have another cousin who is my first cousin, lived 5 miles away. He was identified by his younger brother by his teeth, because he came back from Vietnam as a heroin addict and died in a lot in Harlem. And yesterday, I was called by a friend who is a former police officer who has really sent me a number of cases, to go and meet with a 14-year-old who couldn't drive, so he rode his skateboard over the train station, threw up all over the platform, and was taken off the train by a bunch of cops who did what they do in the old days. They took him home to his parents instead of putting him in jail. And, I don't know if this kid's going to make it or not. We'll see. But, we live in the real world, and we live, with all sorts of people and all sorts of families. And that, affects, I think, and informs all of us. Every lawyer is not a person who comes from, 10 generations of lawyers.
That's true. I think I I used to be a member of a liberal congregation in Manhattan before we moved up here to Westchester, and I served a stint as co-chair of the Social Action Committee of the congregation, and so for a good number of years we ran a homeless shelter in the basement of the congregation, a lunch program on every Wednesday lunch, and I'm having a senior moment now, but for people who were seeking asylum from Central American oppression, in Honduras and El Salvador, Guatemala, we had a program for them. It didn't really affect my lawyering. I have to confess, it was sort of a separate operation, and I maybe it had something to do with some of the approaches to some of the cases that I had, but I can't really put my finger on it.
Mm. Corey, Chris? Somebody
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Chris.
Okay. So some of the things I do outside of my formal job with the state is I do some volunteering work. I do some sponsorship type stuff. I'm in a 12-step recovery program still. And one interesting thing that happened is I once had a lawyer, and to protect their anonymity, I won't give the details of the case, but I had a lawyer that I was connected with. And the fact that I was open about my own recovery and my own background actually inspired this attorney to return to a 12-step program that he had a resentment against for about a decade. And he went to a meeting, a 12-step recovery meeting with me for the first time in 12 years or something like that, maybe 10 years, I don't know, longer. He simply stopped going due to an unresolved resentment with another person in the group. And instead of going to a different group, he quit going altogether, which is not unsurprising. And so that's one of the things that I continue to do. And it's really interesting. When I was in law school, the dean of admissions, a lawyer who I was working for at the time, kind of as I guess, clerk or assistant, something. I was doing all sorts of things for him. And he and the dean of admissions both urged me to be quiet about my federal conviction. They said, if you want to get involved in some policy work and maybe share that you're in recovery from addiction, that's one thing. But you don't have a lot of press on your conviction. It was not a high-profile case. Mm-hmm. And, you don't need to let your past define you in the future. You can just be Chris, the lawyer. And I thought, that's great. I don't need to have my background be part of every analysis when I'm involved in every different decision. It's not really relevant, right, to what's happening in the instant case or to my law school colleagues. So for my first 2 years of law school, I was completely quiet about my background. I wanted my work as a law student to stand on its own. I didn't have to be the guy who went from federal prison to law school. And, I'm glad I did that then. I'm glad I let my work stand on its own and got different accomplishments and stuff in law school without my past ever coming into it. But then I met Michael Botticelli from the Obama White House, and he came into this meeting in Portland, Maine, where I was part of the mayor's meeting on substance use disorder and addiction recovery. And he shared that he was himself in recovery from addiction and actually been arrested for drunk driving and gone to jail for it, although he was quickly released and diverted away from it, and had been in recovery ever since, something like 30 years. But I thought, well, this guy's open about the fact that he's been arrested. This guy's open about the fact that he's in recovery from addiction. he seems to be doing okay professionally. He's the director of national drug control policy for the president of the United States. And at that point, I decided to become open and basically, come out of the closet about my criminal record and started talking about it publicly, and addiction too. And maybe even more importantly, the addiction part, because then lawyers came to me, law students came to me, everyday people came to me, and my messages on Facebook are just flooded to this day. My son just got arrested. I don't know if he's going to make it. And that helps other people, but it also helps me stay sober, and it helps me stay grounded and remember why I do the work that I do, both in my career as well as my work outside of my formal job.
I had a very similar experience in seminary. So I went to seminary, I think, 28 years after I graduated law school. And my first year, I made the same decision. I didn't want to be defined as someone who had been to prison, or someone who had committed a white-collar crime, or someone who had been disbarred. And I wanted my work to stand for me. But I was living, for me, inauthentically. And I knew it, and it was tearing me apart. And I was kind of, dragging my tush in there. And one day I was like, had my head down, and I was full of shame, and I hadn't really felt that kind of shame in a while. And this guy who was sitting in the cafeteria, I was a first year, he was a third year, so he was about to graduate. He called me over and he said, "What's the matter?" And by the way, in seminaries, people do that. They don't do that so much in law schools. And and he said, "What's the matter?" And I said, I don't think I'm getting too much out of this experience. And he said, and he looked right at me and he said, instead of trying to get something out of it, do you think that you might want to try putting something into it? And it was like, I've heard that in recovery every day in recovery, but I couldn't apply it to what was going on in the seminary. And it was a light bulb went off. And at that point, I just knew I had to disclose, and I had to be authentic to who I was. And that's marked my path ever since. So I completely relate to that, Chris. Thank you.
I can relate too, because this comes up in in whistleblower cases and discrimination cases against corporations, where the plaintiff, let's take a whistleblower case. I have a case where the client was fired years ago for whistleblowing, brought a lawsuit, couldn't find alternate employment. And at first he didn't mention the fact, what his experience was. And for 2 years thereafter, 3 years thereafter, he didn't get a job. Didn't help that he didn't mention it. Then he got some advice that maybe he should put it on his resume. And he did, briefly, still didn't get a job. Now, years later, there's a possibility of settling the case, and the question arises, should he agree to be muzzled in return for the settlement payment, if that's the condition of the settlement? Mm-hmm. And sometimes you can agree on the monetary amount that's going to be paid to settle the case. But the question then becomes, is the whistleblower or the discriminator willing to commit to not discussing his case again?
Yeah.
And that's a tough issue for a lot of them.
Yeah, I just want to point out that, Bob, I think you're incredibly humble for a guy with your resume. Because we just talked a couple of weeks ago on the phone about how the life of the civil rights lawyer or someone who handles whistleblower cases, you work for years basically on the principle of a case, and you don't know if you're going to get paid.
That's true, and that's why the human rights practice is not a favored practice in the profession, because you often you work for years. I had a class action strip search case against the Nassau County Jail for their blanket strip search policy. It started in 1999. When I first brought that action in 1999, and the case didn't resolve. We're just finishing up the administrative phase of the case. I didn't get paid on that case for about 16 years. And you often do not, you take on the case on a contingent fee basis. You lay out hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars worth of time. Forget about the expenses because they're often a fraction of the time. And you rely generally on the fee shifting provisions of the civil rights statutes to get paid when you prevail. So if you lose, you get nothing. If you win, it's often up to the judge whether to cut your fee application. So you don't get your lodestar, your hourly rate times all the hours you put in. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you get 20% less, sometimes 30% less. And but that's the nature of the beast. If you want not to have a steady diet of corporate litigation, or cases where it's just about the money, and you want to represent victims, that's sometimes the price of that kind of practice.
Sure. So Corey, you decided you want to go into civil service. I see you all over the place doing support rallies, things that are helping the marginalized and oppressed. How does that inform your decision making?
Yeah, so one, I want to tell Chris, I'm also a Lewisburg alumni, so I'll see you at Union next summer.
What unit were you in?
I was in Unit 1 and then over to RDAP.
Okay, I was Unit.
Was there RDAP there when you were there?
Mm-hmm. I did RDAP at Lewisburg. Okay,
yep. So I was there. Lori Poor, Captain Whitmire, maybe were there when you were there.
Lori Poor was.
Okay, that was my DT. So see, we're brothers now.
Is Doug Contry? Doug Contry's no longer there, right?
No, but Lori Poor was my person. So
what is RDAP?
Say it again.
What is RDAP?
Oh,
those who watching who don't know.
The residential drug abuse program that allows you to earn up to a year off your sentence. Okay. So it's like it's a different prison experience when you do RDAP. So that's a whole nother show. So but I also wanted to echo, Chris, what you were saying about your embracing your past. And so, I've realized, I was given this story for whatever reason. And so when I went back to law school, I led with my story. Hey, I'm the lawyer who got in trouble, who came back to law school. And I ended up getting 2 A's in the courses I took. And I think part of the reason was because I was very vocal about that experience and how it related to my classes. Because I'm doing human rights and social justice. So I can bring those experiences to the courses that I'm taking. And I think it's important. And the students, I think, listen up a little more when I'm speaking, because I can say I tried a murder case to verdict. I've got not guilty verdicts. I've done all that. And I've also been a defendant and been incarcerated. So you have a little more credibility when you're speaking. The other thing I think is important, like, God willing, I get my license back and maybe I can recreate a new firm, is that I think some clients will be attracted to the fact that I have been through the system. And I know what they're going through. And I didn't go to law school to plead them guilty. And I know the anxiety and the stress and what this means to their life if when I'm counseling them. And I think that matters to some people. And I think some people, will appreciate that lived experience that I have, and also my policy work. I'm able to speak from that lived experience as well, doing the criminal justice stuff in New York. So I just kind of, I don't want like that chapter of my life to define me, because I was in the military longer than I was in prison, right? So it's like, at some point, that this was just one chapter of my life. I kind of like analogize it to like if someone goes through a divorce, it's a very traumatic experience, but that's not something, you want to be living every day for the rest of your life. So I kind of feel like that about it. Like this is a chapter, and at some point I want to be known for my successes in the courtroom or in family, or for the community. But yeah, I think it's important to be out there doing advocacy work around these issues. We'd be remiss not to discuss, George Floyd and the protests that are going on, and Black Lives Matter, and kind of where we are in this intersection of racial, social justice, and criminal justice reform. And I really think, America can finally start to do something around being the leaders of mass incarceration in the world. I'm not, and I'll close with this. I'm not afraid to speak up about my past, in part because there's 23 million convicted felons in this country. If we were a state, I think we'd be the size of New York. And there's 70 to 80 million people who have a criminal record of some sorts, even if it's not a conviction. So when you're talking about you can't get into a group of a half a dozen people and not find someone who hasn't been or doesn't have an immediate family member who's been impacted by the criminal justice system. And my law school advisor, I spoke to her about my issue, and she said, I had a very close family member go through that, and I know how hard it was, and I know what you're going through, so anything I can do to help. And we wouldn't have had that moment had I hid that from her.
Yeah. So why don't we go around as we're kind of wrapping up? Why don't we each take an opportunity to speak to the audience of people who are interested in this kind of subject, and whether they be someone who's been prosecuted or somewhere within the ecosystem, and what's the takeaway you'd like them to have about the topic, and at the same time say how you can be reached, and what kind of follow-up that you're willing to do, or you would like people to contact you about. So those are two things. What's the takeaway, and then how can you be reached? And George, why don't we start with you, if that's okay?
Sure. Well, I have been amazed in doing this kind of work. I did a lot of litigation for and against big companies, but I've been amazed now that I'm in a much smaller practice and leading out of Westchester County and Fairfield County, how little individuals know about the legal system. And I often find myself thinking of both the innocent spouse cases and other ones where I have to say to the client, look, meter's off, but let me tell you what's going on here. And explain the system, because they don't understand it. And a lot of lawyers really don't know how to talk to people about the legal system. They just assume that everybody knows what they know, and they don't. So, it's a question of both balancing, what you know versus what they know, and trying to get, without being too technical about it, explaining the whole system to them so they understand. The way to reach me is through my website, which is Ritz Law, HRITZ Law. George at Ritz Law is my email address. And I'm here in Westchester, but I work all over in Westchester and Fairfield counties. I go into the city when I have to, but after commuting to the city for over 40 years, I'm perfectly happy to be up here in an office that's 15 minutes from my home.
That's great, George. Bob.
Well, you can reach me at my email address is R Herbst, my last name, R for Robert, and Herbst at Herbst Law, Lawny for NewYork.com. Or you could probably leave a note on my website also, which is herbstlawny.com. But what I would like to say, in response actually to Corey's suggestion, we should talk about the welling up from below of the dissatisfaction with the racism and the classism in this country. I think it's a tough battle because the forces of reaction are strong. But this could be a moment like the moment in the late 60s and early 70s where we lost the battle. This could be a watershed moment where we regain the ability to get ourselves out of the hole that we have dug for ourselves as a society in the last 50 years. If we can capture the White House, both houses of Congress, we might be able to make progress. And that's not just on the federal level. I'm talking about the state and local level as well. If the progressive forces that are represented by the people who came out in the streets when there was this COVID pandemic, which created a risk for everybody, if we can maintain that as we go forward the next year or two, there might be some hope for us, because we don't have a lot of time, and not just as a national society, but as a global species, to start attacking the existential problems that beset us, like climate change, which I think is encouraging the pandemic and the epidemics that we've experienced in the last 10, 15 years. So I'm hopeful that those as old as George and I, and as young as Corey and Chris, and those even younger, can mobilize and keep this going. Godspeed and blessings to everybody.
Amen, brother. I remember when the politicians used to sound like you. It's it'll be. Let's hope they come back. Corey.
Amen.
Yes, you can reach me at Corey at secondchancefirm.com. So that's my website for my pardons and federal prison consulting work that I do. And, you know, that keeps me connected to the community. And I also have to say I'm not a licensed attorney, and you've been calling me that throughout this evening, and I don't want to get in trouble with the bar.
I'm not either, Corey.
So I'm making clear for this recording that I'm not a licensed attorney, but hope to be readmitted hopefully as soon as next year if all goes well. But I look forward to what the future brings. We all go through things in life and that define us and learn from, and some of us grow from it, and sometimes it breaks us. But I'm hoping, to be a stronger, better person because of all of this, and hopefully, embody the concept of a compassionate lawyer and advocate for people going through a difficult time in their life. So,
thank you, Corey. So, Chris, you're our last speaker tonight, and then I'll say a few words, and we can say our goodbyes.
Sure. Thank you, everyone. So, speaking on the current moment and movement it's been really interesting for me because I've been in the work that I do, both professionally and outside, and all sorts of different. I'm still invited to all sorts of different community organization and movement events, and I'm almost always the only person who works for the government in these spaces. And so it's like I have my job, but then I have my identity that transcends my current employment, and that's I think a beautiful thing that I'm able to have both. But just something that jumped out at me was somebody who doesn't work in dismantling mass incarceration, which is frankly what I'm ultimately after, and creating a new system, not reforming our criminal justice system, but making some fundamental changes. And as they said, how did you go? You went out into the mountains during the middle of this crisis after George Floyd. You went out into the mountains. What are you thinking? We need to be every minute. And I said, it reminded me of Mark Maurer from the Sentencing Project when I was their intern legal fellow during law school in DC. And he said, what we've been doing, Mark said, who just retired as executive director of the Sentencing Project, said, we've been doing this for 30 years now. The cameras come and the cameras go. And we need to, do what we need to do to take care of ourselves through all of this. It's an ongoing struggle, while at the same time, so that's why I went hiking, right, and didn't feel guilty about it during the middle of this, because it's nothing new for me and my work, and it's just ongoing. The cameras are new, and they'll go. At the same time, I think that this is a moment. It is a moment that we could seize onto where we have the attention, and hopefully can create some systemic, ongoing change and transformation. As far as the compassionate lawyering, I think that it's not just the right thing to do morally, it's best for our clients to be able to, whether we're consultants or attorneys or whatever it may be, even in policy work, if you're at all working with individuals, to be able to understand what happens in prison, to understand post conviction relief, to understand sentencing mitigation thoroughly. I think that's an incredible responsibility that all attorneys should have. And I've found that some lawyers or attorneys are phenomenal at understanding case law, but they don't have a clue on what happens when it comes to creating the best pre-sentence report, if it's the federal system or in some states, possible to paint a picture of the client as holistically as can be for everyone from the judge to the prosecutor to the jury, etc. And that's something that I found helped immensely in my own federal criminal defense, was working hand in hand with my attorney to be able to show, whether it was going to be a judge, jury, or just the prosecutor, the full picture of my background, to share about the trauma that I endured, to share about all of that stuff. And I ended up, I didn't cooperate in my case. I ended up getting a guideline sentence in a plea eventually. But I got the very low end, and the judge took into factor all of what we presented to the court. And I don't know that every lawyer would have done as thorough of a job of presenting the client as a human being and not only looking at the legal aspects. And finally, it reminds me of that we have the title, if we're attorneys, or when we will be attorneys, of both attorney at law and counselor. And I don't expect us to we're not licensed mental health counselors, so to speak, but we are supposed to counsel our clients on all the ramifications of our decisions and their decisions. And that's something I try to bring to my daily work, whether it involves law, my students, or otherwise, is that it's not just what's the case law on this and can I get them to 22 months from 23 months. It's counseling on all of the factors involved and all of the consequences, including, for me, when I got clearance to be an intern in the White House during law school, I had to have top secret eligible national security position clearance. And then I tried to rent an apartment in Washington, D.C., and I was turned down because I had a criminal record. I had to tell the White House, I'm sorry, I'd love to come, but I can't get past Bobby, the landlord, due to my criminal record. So anyway, that's just something that I would have loved for my attorney to understand, things like that in the process. But he did a great job nonetheless. And it's really, I've really enjoyed this. I do a ton of interviews and podcasts and stuff like that. And I really want to just thank the other guests because I really, really enjoyed being on here with you all. And I hope we remain connected after. Thank you.
Same here.
Yeah, all of your information will be in the show notes after, and I'll be sending you all links to the show and to the notes and everything as soon as it goes live.
I actually forgot to share mine. Sorry, it's www.commerce.wa.gov/reentry, one word. And email is Christopher.Poulos, Poulos, @commerce.wa.gov.
Thanks, Chris. And I want to end with what a deep and lasting impression that I know this is going to have on me, because we work with people who've been prosecuted or being prosecuted for white-collar crimes, and I have conversations with lawyers all the time, maybe even daily. And we have a white-collar support group that meets on Mondays, and we've been doing it for 4 years now on Zoom, or we used to be on its predecessor. And one of the things that we express to the lawyers is that if I were going for a job, if I committed a crime 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, and I were going for a job, the question I would ask the person who's applying for the job is, all right, so what have you done in the last 4 or 5 years? And it seems that people don't know when they're facing these things that what you do right now counts. You know, what you're doing right now in terms of service, how you are reaching out for help to others, how you are interacting with the world right now counts. And you should be able to document all of that. And if one of those things is going to a support group and working on yourself and your own self-improvement, not only should you do it, but you should do it in a way that it can be documented so that someone can write recommendation letters for you and things like that. So thank you all. And I trust that you'll take calls from anyone who's watching this. Thank you for joining us on White Collar Week, sponsored by Progressive Prison Ministries. You can learn more about us on our website, prisonist.org. That's prisonist, like feminist. And please remember to rate, review, and share this podcast so that families suffering in silence can find us if they need us. See you next time.